You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Skagit County has been hit by multiple waves of catastrophic flooding over the past week. Amid the devastation, there is a bright spot. On Friday, the flood wall in Mount Vernon successfully held off the Skagit River as it rose to a record 37.7 feet. It kept water from inundating the city's downtown area. The Skagit is rising again, by the way, expected to crest tonight around 10 p.m. as of this hour's National Weather Service estimates. That Mount Vernon floodwall only exists because it sits in an area determined by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to be at highest risk of flooding. Many residents of Skagit County might be unaware of the current flooding risk to their homes or businesses, though. That's because, according to the Seattle Times, Skagit County's flood maps haven't been updated in 40 years. Lulu Ramadan is an investigative reporter who wrote about this in the Seattle Times, and she joins me now to talk about what's going on with these maps and why some people actually don't want to see them updated. Lulu, thank you very much for being here, and thanks for your reporting.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Can you explain first what FEMA flood maps are and what they're good for, basically? What do they do?
Absolutely. So FEMA flood maps are essentially used to predict what parts of a given area are most susceptible to high-risk flooding. FEMA takes data from a number of places, different types of data, including the conditions of levees and water levels, historic water levels, to produce these boundaries that show what the so-called 100-year floodplain, which I'm sure a term that everyone in the region has probably heard a number of times.
We're getting more familiar with it, right? It means basically that you're in a given year on a 1% chance of flooding, right?
That's right. And so FEMA creates this map because it's supposed to give the public and government officials a tool to determine what places are at high risk so they can prepare. And that includes mandatory flood insurance for all buildings and homes that are backed by or that include a federally backed mortgage. And it also is supposed to inform people that flood insurance in general is probably something that you might want to consider. And that's part of a national flood insurance program run by the federal government to basically underwrite flood impacts. So there's a number of reasons why these FEMA maps exist, and they're supposed to be a tool for the government to kind of prepare and plan and know what areas are at highest risk.
And you wrote that flood wall in Mount Vernon is there because of the FEMA projections, right? How did that go down?
Yeah, so there were two primary reasons that Mount Vernon chose to build that flood wall, particularly that flood wall to the standards that they did build it to. One reason was, of course, to protect the downtown from flooding. It historically has experienced flooding, and that was a big interest, was if we can avoid it, we should. Building it to the standard that they did was specifically because of FEMA and these flood maps. FEMA determined that all the areas in that downtown were susceptible to flooding and therefore had to have that mandatory insurance. There's also development restrictions that come with those FEMA flood maps and that 100-year floodplain designation. And, those are kind of pesky things to a lot of local governments and homeowners. Some people don't want mandatory insurance. Some people don't want to build to specific standards. And so Mount Vernon took the step of building this wall to a standard that FEMA would consider to remove that designation of the 100-year floodplain. And it was supposed to open up some economic opportunities. And of course, the reason for that is because the flood wall would protect from flooding. And so it was a long and expensive endeavor, but the city decided to do it. And the flooding, when the water crested at that 37.7 feet, it really did illustrate that flood wall, it held up. And it was, in a lot of ways, a good example of why those FEMA flood maps exist and how they can help.
Skagit County overall has not updated that FEMA flood map in 40 years. Is it common in our region to have the maps be 40 years without an update?
It's not all that common, and it's honestly not all that common on a national level. FEMA flood maps are supposed to be updated on a 5-year basis, and that doesn't always happen. In general, FEMA flood maps are considered outdated, but to that degree, the 40 years, it's pretty uncommon. On a national level, nonprofit First Street found that only 11% of FEMA flood maps date back to the 80s and even the 70s. And so Skagit's maps are particularly outdated. And other counties, neighboring counties, have updated their maps in the past, I'd say like 6 or 7 years, some even earlier. And so one of the reasons for that is because of a lot of pushback, interestingly enough, from the community, from those in the Skagit Valley.
Yeah, tell me more about that. So, we're talking about a huge river, the Skagit River, and a landscape around the Skagit River, which we have basically terraformed, into farmland, which used to be marshes and floodplain. So, this is an area that is known to be flood prone. Why would people in Skagit County, some people, not want to see the flood maps updated?
That's a great question. And it's not necessarily uncommon on a national scale, too, but a lot of those I just kind of keep going to that word pesky, those pesky requirements that come along with those flood designations, things like mandatory insurance and those building standards. There's typically some resistance to those factors. And updating those FEMA flood maps could mean that there are more areas that are included in and then required to meet those standards. And so there's a bit of pushback in the community, and I mean that can be impactful because we don't actually know how the flood protection systems in Skagit County exist today and how they would be impacted and particularly maybe hardened and strengthened should those maps be updated.
So, people looking at the kind of building standards, the insurance premiums, all of this is a factor. Extra regulation, not always super popular, especially if you want to build things. Lulu, who actually makes the call, though, to update the maps?
That's actually a combination. So FEMA has a process in place where they include local officials and the community in those decisions to update the maps, particularly the conversations around what those maps look like. And so, as part of that process, they're engaging local government, which would take on a cost to update those flood protections, things like levees and dikes and dams. And then, as well as the community, because they might have concerns or thoughts, let's say your individual home gets looped into a floodplain, but it actually hasn't flooded in a really long time, or even as long as you've owned it. And all of a sudden, you're subject to mandatory insurance. You might think, why is my home being included? It actually hasn't flooded, unlike some of my neighbors or other neighborhoods. So they engage the community because they want to make sure that they're including those voices and taking them into consideration along with the science that goes behind flood mapping.
What about people who say that the maps do need to be updated? What kind of arguments are you hearing?
Yeah, there are proponents for updating those maps. Essentially, the idea behind them is to help give a tool to local governments and communities to protect from flooding. And so I go back to that Mount Vernon flood wall and the idea that these maps really, in a lot of ways, pressured Mount Vernon to build its flood wall to the standard that it did. There was always an interest, as I understand it, in Mount Vernon to build a flood wall. But the decision to kind of build it to those FEMA standards, which can be pretty high because they're trying to protect against that 100-year flood, that sort of thought to be rare event. They ended up building it to the degree that they did, and so it held up in that instance in the recent flooding. And I think that some people think that that's a pretty significant sign that these flood maps can actually be a really good tool.
It's hard. I mean, you said before, we don't really know what an updated flood map would look like. And if any of the properties, homes, and businesses that have been damaged in this flood that were not included in the flood map that was made 40 years ago would be included in the one made today. What are you watching for as this story unfolds and as you continue covering this issue, Lulu? I mean, what questions do you still have? What do you think are the next steps here?
Yeah, I mean, a big question is have some of these homes that are outside of the floodplain in that flood map, have they flooded? Because there's the possibility that they, while mandatory, might have flood insurance. And, that doesn't preclude anyone in the area from tapping into whatever FEMA disaster relief does end up coming down to the entire region. But the reality that sometimes that flood insurance can be incredibly helpful in situations like this. And I guess the whole caveat, though, is that even with that flood map, even in the floodplain, and even with the strongest levees possible, there's no guarantee that they'll hold up to flooding. And one point we made in the story was that there's really no way to know for sure if that Mount Vernon flood wall will hold up in future flooding. And it's essentially that data is the best guess they have.
Lulu Ramadan is an investigative reporter for the Seattle Times. She wrote the story about the fact that in Skagit County, they haven't updated flood maps in 40 years, the FEMA 100-year floodplain, and the reasons behind that, and also the implications going forward. And I'm curious to see also whether or not this flooding event, Lulu, changes that calculation. Really appreciate the reporting and your conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman, and now we're going to turn south to Pierce County, where flooding along the Puyallup River forced a dog adoption league to evacuate a group of malamutes last week.
I would say it really turned very quickly about it going from something that we would monitor to get out now.
That's Kristiana de Leon with the Washington Alaskan Malamute Adoption League. She says water was rising so quickly that they had to make a game-time decision, which is hard because de Leon said some of these dogs come to the Adoption League with trauma.
So ultimately, we had to figure, is this worth the psychological risk? Is it worth the physical risk to transport them? And that's when we had to decide that it was just better to be safe than sorry, because it was evacuate now, and this was at least inches of water right away from the property, like just down the street. So then we decided, okay, let's load up all the crates, load up all the dogs, find emergency shelter, and transport them.
De Leon rushed to navigate her 6 furry passengers to safe ground as conditions continued to worsen.
Finally, GPS no longer lets me know what's going to be a safe route and keeps routing me towards a road closure, because I know that would mean that road is flooded over. And I'm just going through layers of this water.
She eventually made it out and got the dogs to pause VIP in Tukwila, where they stayed overnight to ride out the flooding. They're back at the kennel now, but De Leon says she's still left with some big picture questions about what to do in the face of future flooding.
We are going to have to be really concerned now about insurance. We are going to have to worry about the other expenditures related to the upkeep of a place that'll be completely flooded out. We're all volunteer run. There's nobody salaried on this. We are just all people who care. It's just going to be harder and harder to sort of make sure that we can financially prepare for these crises at the same moment that we know that donations are coming down. That's the tried and true song of a lot of nonprofits and charities everywhere. But we're definitely literally in that way in that same boat as well.
By the way, as Kristiana was doing this interview, she had one Malamute there with her next to the computer, Abby, who was making her presence known throughout the interview. You might have heard her groaning in the background because there was a squirrel outside. If you want to help the Washington Alaskan Malamute Adoption League, they have a website. It's called wamal.com, WAMAL.com. Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.